We know that when you lose someone you love, there are generally 7 stages of grief. But when it comes to the climate and climate grief, it's a little more complicated. My next guest has spent a lot of time with crying scientists. Dr. Jonica Newby is a science reporter, author, TV presenter and director. She grew up in Perth and spent 20 years with ABC TV show Catalyst. But her job was a blessing and a burden. When she interviewed an American snow scientist, Dr. Jim White, there were tears. It happened again when she spoke to a young coral scientist researching the Great Barrier Reef. But when her longtime partner and TV presenter, science journalist Robin Williams fainted in front of her, it changed her life. Her book is called Beyond Climate Grief. Good afternoon, Jonica.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming on. Can we start there?
Robin, it wasn't a faint.
Yeah,
it wasn't a faint.
It wasn't a faint. It was more than that. Tell me what happened that day and how this inspired your exploration of climate grief.
Yes. So my partner, for those who don't know, is the very famous Robin Williams, who's the science show host on Radio National. We've been together a couple of decades. Anyway, so we were home one day a few years ago on our weekender. It was around New Year's, and I was out on the deck. Unusually, I was home because normally I would have been out surfing at that hour, but for some reason I was home. Anyway, I'm happy. It's a beautiful day. I'm reading my book, and I hear a thump inside, and I keep reading, and then I think, oh, something bothers me. Maybe I'll just go and have a look and see what that thump is. And I open the door, and there inside is my partner of 20 years lying on the floor, and he is white. I mean white, white, white. His mouth is gaping. He's not breathing. He's actually doing this sort of agonal breathing, which is this sort of spasmic reaction. And I could see all these flowers out the back door. It was a stunning day, and I was flying across the floor, and I was just thinking, oh my God, this is the day he dies, this is the day he dies, he's dying right now, he's dying right now. I was feeling for a pulse, looking at him, all these thoughts running through my head. I didn't know if you could start CPR. I didn't know how to do CPR. I'd last learnt when I was 10 in swim class. And then, so anyway, about 3 minutes had gone by, and with my veterinary training, I remembered that when you get to about 4 minutes without oxygen, you start to get brain damage. And there I was looking down at one of the smartest people in our country, and I thought, here goes. And I just started pressing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And on 6, a line of pink went all the way up his body and up his head, and he woke up. And and then he said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, just give me a minute. And I rolled him into the coma position, and
You saved his life.
I did, and I honestly didn't think that was possible. So it was a pretty intense time, and I didn't actually ever tell anyone about it. It was too much, only a couple of close friends. So
what else was happening in your life at that time, Jonica?
Well, actually, this other grief, this other profound moment happened a couple of years later, but I had to then look back on this and I could see similarities. So a couple of years later, and I'll talk about this in a second, but about why it happened, but I got hit emotionally in the guts by profound depression, which I later learnt to term climate grief, which completely surprised me because, I've been a science reporter for all those years and I thought I knew a bit about climate change, but it turned out it was just intellectual. I hadn't actually registered what it meant emotionally. And when that did happen and I was trying to process it over the next couple of years, I kept thinking back on that day with Robin and I realised there were some real similarities. So for one, there was the fact that Robin got up and, refused to go to the hospital. I had to, take an hour to persuade him to go because he was in complete denial. And he was in denial that he could die. So here he was, this science reporter. He's like the arch hater of climate deniers. And he was this total metaphor for denial. And I realised that, and I do have a chapter later in the book about denial, about how we all have denial and how we evolved to have it, because otherwise, we'd never go out of the caves every day. We thought, we might die today. So it's actually a really important thing. But, of course, there comes a time where, as an individual person or as, with the climate, where you've got to flip your brain over and go, oh, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I do need to take action, or something really terminal is going to happen. So that was the first thing I thought back on. But look, there was another thing, and this was love, which is actually the title of the second chapter of the book, which I tell this story in. So it struck me suddenly that, look, when you've got a partner, he had cancer at the time and he was on chemo, and I think the dehydration is what triggered this heart block that happened to him. Yeah. So when you love someone and they get a cancer diagnosis that could be terminal, you get all this grief. You get all this kind of anticipatory grief, but do you turn away? Do you stop? You think, oh, no, too hard, too hard. No. Not going to think about that. Yeah. You don't. While they're still alive, you do what would you do to save the one you love? You do whatever you can. And so when I was confronted for a long while trying to work out how to get through this terrible depression and climate grief, I suddenly realised the similarities that, look, I love this place that's under threat, but it's not dead yet. It's like that thing with Robin. Instead of being all fearful all the time, why not think about it in terms of love and just think, what would you do to save the one you love? Yeah. You do whatever you can. And I think this is such a powerful idea when we look at our emotional journey through what's ahead with climate change.
It's so interesting because we never talk about environment and the emotional. We rarely do. 2:45, my guest is Jonica Newby. She grew up in Perth, spent 20 years with Catalyst, a prolific science reporter, and her new book is called Beyond Climate Grief. So I was going to say each chapter talks about a different emotion. It's very clever. Now I understand why you have formatted it in this way. Shall we talk about why we even feel grief for the climate? Is it our love of the land?
For me, it is, absolutely. For some people, it's their kids and their fears, but I think, you could have that and, it's complex. You can have all these loves. So I should just say, I'd like to say the subtitle of my book, by the way, because otherwise it sounds very dreary, and this is not a dreary book.
Oh, no, yes, please. Stretch. Please, I'll let you say this. Yes, yes.
So the full title is Beyond Climate Grief, A Journey of Love, Snow, Fire and an Enchanted Beer Can. So, yes. So that gives you more of a sense of where you're going. And
I'm glad we've cleared that up. It's not dreary, not at all. And you've got so many well-known characters in here. It's such an important book. So let's talk about why you love the climate enough to feel so strongly.
Yeah, well, let's get more specific, because you can say you love all children, but it's not true. You're more likely to love your own, right? So it's the same with places, that we all have places that we fall in love with. Either we love them because, they've been in the family. If you're Indigenous, it's your country. If you're a more displaced person who's moved around, often you fall in love. And we have more than one place. And so the place that I fell in love with, one of a couple, is snow. and I fell in love with snow before I even met snow. I grew up in Cottesloe.
Yeah.
And I was staring
no snow
out
there.
at exactly, about 3,000 kilometres from the nearest mountains. And I'm staring out at the, white sands of Cottesloe Beach, and I'm imagining mountains and dragons and enchanted peaks and the possibility of magic. Of course I am, because all our fairy stories talk about snow. It's so much part of our imaginative world. Christmas, the fables, they come from sort of old Nordic traditions and so on. And so it's an imaginative world. It sparkles and it feels like magic. And so when I moved east eventually and started with Catalyst, I was able to start visiting Australia's snow country, Kunam and Namaji, and I got to fall in love with a real place, with magical creatures there that are real, like pygmy possums and wombats that live in snow caves and snow gums that glitter like chandeliers when their leaves are covered in ice. And so I used to escape there during the weekends in winter. I'd be making my Catalyst shows, being a proper science reporter during the week, and then I'd turn on the Lord of the Rings soundtrack on a Friday, drive down to the snow ski like a demon for 2 days, pretending I was on the back of a dragon and come back.
Are you even from Perth anymore if you can ski like that, Jonica? I don't know.
Sure
Let's talk about this, because the ski season in the US is 35 days shorter than it used to be. And you spoke to Dr. Jim White, who is an American snow scientist, and when you spoke to him, he cried. What was that like for you?
Yeah, well, by that stage, I'd also started crying. So I'd had a moment, and this was the inciting incident in the book. This is part of the first chapter of the book, and then it goes on an adventure. So it's a pretty adventurous book. I was in Japan 2017, and while I was there, I met this French Swiss ski instructor that I was hanging out with. Well, what's he doing there in January? So I asked him, and he said there was no snow in Europe, so he'd come to find good snow. And I was shocked. And later that week, half the Great Barrier Reef died. And I went, oh, my God, global warming can get my fantasy place. You know, my logic world and my fantasy world had collided. And that's what sent me plummeting into climate grief. And I spent a year researching what was going to happen to the snow. And that's how I met Jim White, the scientist you talk about. And, yeah, I asked him, I looked at him and I said, are we the generation that kills snow? And he looked at me and he started crying and said, he couldn't answer. And then he said, I just think about my grandson not being able to make a snowman. And, so at the end of all this, I actually hit a pretty crippling state, to the point where when I got back, I ended up really tired, and I ended up going to my doctor asking for antidepressants. And that's the first time in my life I've done that, even though I have had depression in the past. And so this was a pretty profound moment in my life. And I took the first antidepressant, and then I didn't take another. I did something completely different, and that becomes the adventure that you go on, that journey that ends up with the enchanted beer can and a lot more.
Yeah. Dr. Jonica Newby is my guest, 9 minutes to 3 on ABC Radio Perth. You're with Christine Layton. We need snow, don't we? It's not just for recreation.
We do. And so by telling the story of snow and telling it through this sort of, storytelling way that I have, you're also telling like a metaphor for any ecosystem, if you like. So snow itself, a lot of people may not realise, apart from it being part of, the economy and lifestyle of so many people and places, it's white, so it reflects light, and it actually helps protect us from runaway global warming. So as the areas become darker, then we get more heat from the sun. And the other thing it does is it provides like 55 Hoover dams, or 55 million Hoover dams around the world to provide our drinking water. So it's an essential ingredient. But you could pick any major ecosystem. I just tell it through the prism of snow. But that's the only sort of climate bomb only truth bomb that's in the book. And I think it's such a surprising one for people that they never really think about it. And I certainly hadn't, it's my fantasy place.
Yeah, and especially when you're from WA, because we only get, maybe a dusting of snow on Bluff Knoll if the conditions are right. Well, there have been other events in history. But shall we talk about your mum, because she features in your chapter titled Horror. Now, she lives in Malakuta and was there during the summer fires. You feature her and someone else. Can you tell me about that chapter?
Yes, I will. But I'm going to backtrack a bit, because I guess I need to set up why I actually wrote the book, because I didn't intend to. The climate grief thing wasn't enough to set me off on the path of writing a book. No, what happened was I started a couple of years later to hear other people talking about their heart places and sort of bursting into tears. And I was looking around and going, oh, my God, I'm not the only one struggling with this. I don't know how to go ahead with this. So I had this idea that if I was a science reporter, I could do something similar to Lee Sales' Any Ordinary Day, right? I could start with my own story, then go and get, inspiring other people and tell them this and get them to tell me their stories. So, yeah, I do actually interview Missy Higgins and Charlie Pickering and Craig Rucastle and a whole lot of really surprising, fabulous people. But the thing was, I started writing the book in October 2019. And, of course, my great plan fell out the window, because I'm in New South Wales, and our world was just tipping upside down. I mean, I can't explain to you what it was like when we hadn't actually seen the sun or been able to breathe smokeless air for 6 weeks, and then 2 months, and then 3 months, and then things got worse, And so you had this sense, if you're over here on the East Coast, that we'd all fallen into the plot of some sort of epic narrative, novel or film. And even the newspapers were using words like apocalyptic and monster and beast and all these things straight out of epic narrative. And I'd been interested in Lord of the Rings from the beginning. I'd pointed out that, it was almost, I suddenly realised it's almost like that story was real because, it was literally black coal versus white snow. And then these resonances keep coming back. So it took on this, it became a much more personal memoir, which was never meant to be, but there was no other way I could write about this, which is why it's such an adventure story.
But that's what makes it so unique. It is such a brilliant book in that regard because you do have these personal experiences to draw from as well. Did your mum get out okay, Jonica?
Yeah, so prior to that, I was there writing about how we never think disaster is going to happen to us. Well, and 2 weeks later, I get proven that we never think disaster is going to happen to us because I didn't think it was coming for Malakuta and my mum. So there's an unbelievably vivid chapter about that. Mum did get out just a few hours beforehand. She was one of the few that did, and I'm so glad because she's 77 years old and her house is right on the edge of the forest. And so when I woke up that morning and saw the Fires Near Me app, and it said 10 minutes till it hits, and it was going to hit right where her house was. And I just couldn't stop shaking and crying. And Mum was out, she was sitting calm. We were both kind of watching it from a distance. And then a couple of weeks later, I got to go in there as soon as Malakuta opened because it was cut off for weeks. And for those that remember, I mean, I know from WA, you've just had your own experience now. You kind of get what we went through. But imagine that lasting 3 months and it's like that every day and keeps getting worse. And the, how much you'd feel like you'd fallen into a film. Anyway, so I got to talk to some of Mum's friends. It wasn't pre-planned. I just sat down and talked to them. And out of that became this unbelievably vivid picture of what it was like to be on that day. And shall I tell you about Nick and the disaster movie Dash? Because that's one of the most extraordinary stories. So these were just ordinary people, right? They were not trained firefighters. Nicholas was 30 years old. He had never fought a fire, but he decided to try and stay and defend because he'd just bought a new home. He had 2 young kids and he couldn't bear the thought of having to start again, even though they'd been told by the RFS that they wouldn't be protected.
Yeah.
So he and his father-in-law, they were up other opposite ends of the street, but they were in contact by walkie-talkies. But when the fire came, the walkie-talkies were useless because it sounded like 747s on your head. And, it's smoke-filled. There's fire everywhere. It's red and it's black and you can barely see. And then at one point, Nicholas had the power lines come down next to his house, so he decides he's got to get out. So he hops on his bike. He pedals like the wind down a corridor of fire. I kid you not. The fire was either side in the houses and the trees, going 4 times the height of the trees. He gets to the stairs to the beach, which was his escape plan, and the stairs are on fire. So he runs down the burning stairs. He gets to the beach on fire. He can't go that way, so he goes that way. Then another fire front comes through and he does this enormous loop, and he comes back and he keeps fighting the fire. And at the end of it, he says to me, looking up and sort of grieving, I'm just a person with 2 buckets. But you know what? It's 2 buckets. That's what he was fighting the fire with. He saved his house. Lots of people didn't, but he did.
Wow.
And 5 other houses. And it just made me realise that, when it comes to climate change, it's one way to think about it. We're all just a person with 2 buckets. And we want to kind of do what we can.
Jonica, we've only got a minute until news.
Damn.
I know. I know. Would you believe that we've been talking for 20 minutes, but it's so fascinating. In a few words, this is a cruel question in a way. Yeah. How do we tackle our climate grief? You spoke to psychologists. Yeah. You include this in your book. Why should people read it?
Yeah, this is the journey, and it actually ended up fairly profound. So I can't tell you everything that's in it, but I will tell you that I found some of the answers about how to think about this. There's some philosophies called active hope. There's a whole lot of stuff about acceptance. And you really, the great thing about the book is it tells you in this real storytelling style, like nothing I've seen in any books out there. That's why I want to write this. I wanted to write a book that I would enjoy reading, funnily enough. But the thing is, if we don't come to terms with our emotions about this, then we get stuck in either paralysis and denial or terrible anger, and we get stuck. And so we actually do need to confront the way we personally, individually feel about this, so that we're left with enough lightness and motivation and inspiration and joy to actually
live our lives.
And contribute to acting like you do with your partner. You know, you do what you can to save the one you love.
Exactly. Well, Jonica, it's been great to speak to you. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Dr. Jonica Newby, she is a science reporter, author, TV presenter and director. 20 years with Catalyst. Her book is Beyond Climate Grief, A Journey of Love, Snow, Fire and an Enchanted Beer Can. It's 3:00.